Hello everyone. So for this video, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the 1970s. Specifically what we're going to look at is the economic shifts and particularly the effects of the 1973-74 Arab oil embargo on really kind of creating this period of transition for the American economy that proves to be very disruptive and ultimately ends up having rather significant political consequences. As I mentioned in a previous video, starting with 1968 and the election of Richard Nixon, the United States is really already beginning really in the process of a massive political realignment that won't fully solidify itself until the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And a similar type of realignment was occurring during the 1970s in the economy, in economic areas. And there's a number of reasons why the economy in the 1970s undergoes these really quite painful and quite, in many cases, profound shifts. Really, the 1970s marks the beginning of the period where the US begins shifting away from being a primarily manufacturing, industrial economy to one that is increasingly dedicated to what can best be described as a combination service and knowledge economy. One focused increasingly on knowledge fields, the developing computer science field, which really begins to take off in the 1970s, as exemplified by the career of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in creating Apple. And Also simultaneous to it, the rapid shift from the principal forms of employment for working class Americans from being working class or from being industrial, well-paying, oftentimes well-paying union jobs in manufacturing to increasingly an economy characterized by um, what can most charitably be described as um, precarious employment in service industries characterized by low wages, a lack of union protection, and a distinct lack of stability and certainty. So there's a lot of major changes that begin in the 1970s. It takes a while for these changes to really kind of shake out. Ultimately, it'll take several decades for this transition to really fully occur, but it does begin in the 1970s. And so it's important to look at why that transition from um, an industrial manufacturing economy that the U.S. was at the beginning of the post-war era, when 2 out of every 3 goods made in the world are made in the United States, to um, a country where increasingly fewer and fewer goods are made in this country. It really is worth looking at why those things happen. And so there's a couple of big causes for why there is this massive economic instability in the 1970s. A big part of it has to do, again, with, like so many things during this period, with the Vietnam War. When the Vietnam War was at its apex, many defense contractors were receiving massive government subsidies and actually increasing the sizes of their workforces to build things for government contracts. And once the U.S. begins withdrawing from Vietnam and the process of Vietnamization and the gradual drawing down of the defense budget, which actually, for the only time since the end of the Second World War, declined by more than 20% after in the entire period of the Cold War, declines after Vietnam up until really almost the beginning of the Reagan presidency. And the reason for this is, again, this sort of, very understandable degree of cynicism and this desire to avoid unnecessary foreign entanglements and wars like the disastrous one that we had just gotten out of in Vietnam. But of course, that does have effects for people who work in those industries. And so, as a result of America's drawdown in Vietnam, Many defense contractors like Boeing and many others slash their workforce. And so this leads to growing numbers of a growing amount of unemployment. The costs of the war also began to affect the economy as well. Vietnam was a very expensive war. And so you have these two things coinciding with one another by the early 70s. And Vietnam is not the sole cause of this, but it does help fuel this phenomenon that the media comes to refer to as stagflation, which is rising inflation and rising unemployment occurring simultaneously. And basically, there's a number of causes behind stagflation. The rising deficits that come about as a result of the Vietnam War, which Johnson tried to offset by cutting social programs, which of course undercut his principal goal of reducing poverty, and as well as the declining production of many major industries that had contributed to the war effort as a result of the American withdrawal from Vietnam. Um, but it's not just those industries that are affected that help cause stagflation. Another factor is that when you get to the early 70s, the kind of peak baby boomer years reach adulthood. The people born during the peak of the baby boomer era, that is, begin reaching adulthood. And this coincides with a period when there's fewer jobs available. And so, you know, there's a higher amount of unemployment than there is jobs available. And add to that is the fact that wages begin to stagnate, prices of consumer goods um, begin to raise higher. And another factor of this is just the general decline of American industry as a whole. American industry during the 1970s really takes a couple of pretty big gut punches from both foreign competition and ultimately from the 1973 Arab oil embargo, which I'll be discussing here in a few moments. Basically, at the end of World War II, when the US launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe's economy, it was an enormous boon for American manufacturers and for American industry because you basically had this entire new market created that was being flooded with American money. And so many American companies were able to expand during the early post war period by capitalizing on the fact that they could basically go into these new markets and not have to worry about any major competition. And the same was true with domestic manufacturing. The automobile and steel industries enjoyed very little foreign competition during the post war period, especially the American automobile industry. But by the late 1960s, the economies, ironically enough, the economies of the two nations that the United States, through its industrial supremacy, had defeated in the Second World War, Germany and Japan, their post war rebuilding efforts begin to significantly erode American industry. And there's a number of reasons why. Basically, when during World War II, the United States had leveraged its massive industrial um, capacity to essentially annihilate the entire industrial base of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. These countries have had their factories destroyed, their railroad infrastructure destroyed, their oil infrastructure completely obliterated by the American and British bombing campaigns. And so when the war ended, they were left little alternative but to basically start from scratch. And so what that meant is that after World War II, Germany and Japan, when they begin rebuilding their factories, they invest in the newest, most up-to-date equipment that they can find, equipment which oftentimes involves labor-saving things, but also can improve the quality of goods. And so they begin manufacturing these goods using these cost-effective, but also producing measures that also allow them to produce higher quality goods. And so by the late 60s, both Germany and Japan are competing with the United States in both steel and automobile production. And it's in the latter area in particular that this ends up becoming very much a problem. And the Arab oil embargo plays a particular role in this. Basically, American manufacturers after World War II, in many instances, felt content to rest on their laurels and didn't put a lot of emphasis on R&D or investing in new types of technologies. Some business leaders blamed this on the excessive controls wielded by unions, which kept them from embracing these sort of things. But the fact of the matter is, um, during the post-war period, most of major American industries just didn't feel the need to embrace new technologies, new methods of manufacturing, or new ways to look at the products they sold, because they were so accustomed to American dominance in these areas that they just didn't really feel that much of a threat coming from foreign sources. And so when that foreign threat emerges in the late 60s, early 70s, it kind of comes up from behind and bites them in the ass. Um, and so basically by the early 1970s, the Japanese and the Germans, along with a number of other countries that the US provided economic aid to, are competing with the United States with goods that are cheaper, oftentimes of higher quality, and which in the case of automobiles are more efficient. And that kind of brings to the whole thing about the oil embargo. All of the various economic shocks that come during the 1970s have a complex multitude of causes, far too many to discuss in a short video like this. But by far the single biggest effect on the economy during the 1970s, and the thing that really plunges the United States into a full-fledged recession towards the end of Richard Nixon's presidency, which would endure throughout the presidencies of both of his successors, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and actually wouldn't come to an end until about 3/4 of the way through the first term of Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. The biggest cause of this recession was the 1973 Arab oil embargo. And a little bit of background about this. And this was something that also testifies to the changing nature of the American economy. Basically, there's two important things to bear in mind when looking at the Arab oil embargo and why it ends up having such a devastating impact on the American economy. The first thing about this is that the Arab oil embargo reflects broader geopolitical considerations that the United States had been engaged in since the end of World War II in the Middle East. The Middle East had become an increasingly important focus of American foreign policy during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations. Basically, after World War II, which was, a war that, of course, came about in part because of the failure of the United States and other countries to check Nazi aggression in Europe. A new country is formed in the Middle East, Israel. The origins of the State of Israel actually go back a lot further than this, and they're a lot more complicated. The whole history of the Mandate of Palestine after World War I, and a lot of back and forth that I'm not going to go into. But basically, in 1948, a new state is formed in the Middle East, the State of Israel. And President Harry Truman, who felt that the United States had borne some responsibility for the Holocaust by not allowing Jewish immigrants entry into the United States to escape the Nazis, and moreover, feeling that the United States and the world hadn't really done enough to stop the Nazis, he saw letting a new Jewish state be established in Israel as a sort of penance, I guess, would be one way of looking at it. But he saw it as a morally appropriate response to the Holocaust. And so when Israel is established in 1948, Truman, without hesitation, announces American support for the state of Israel, even as Israel finds itself from that point onward in a near constant state of warfare with its Arab Muslim neighbors. And those conflicts in the Middle East intensify throughout the late 40s and the 1950s. In 1967, when the U.S. is at the height of a stalemated and ultimately doomed military campaign in Vietnam, um, Israel launches a massive preliminary strike on its Arab neighbors, specifically Egypt and Syria and Jordan, all of which were planning to attack Israel at some point in the near future. This leads to a conflict known as the Six-Day War, which, as its name implies, is a war of a very short duration. It is, however, very, very decisive and decidedly one-sided. During the Six-Day War, the Israelis, again, by launching a series of preemptive surprise attacks on targets in Israel, or in Egypt, rather, sorry, and Syria, managed to seize massive areas and expand the size of their country. They seized the Sinai Desert from Egypt. They seized the Golan Heights from Syria, and they seize the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, from Jordan during the Six-Day War. And it's a completely lopsided, one-sided victory. Israel just completely wipes the floor with all of the Arab neighbors that attack it in the Six-Day War. It's a complete humiliation for them. And so naturally, in the face of such a humiliation, Israel's Arab neighbors want to avenge their loss and regain territory that they had lost in the Six-Day War. And so 6 years later, while Richard Nixon is in the midst of the Watergate scandal, in the autumn of 1973, Egypt and Syria launch a massive surprise attack on the Israelis that coincides with the Jewish High Holy Day, Yom Kippur, which is why this is known ever since as the Yom Kippur War. Initially, the Egyptian and Syrian forces, which were largely armed and equipped by the Soviet Union, managed to achieve surprise over their Israeli counterparts. But eventually, the Israelis gained the upper hand, in no small part because the Nixon administration began sending massive amounts of American military aid to Israel, including fighter jets that had just recently been, kind of mothballed from the Vietnam War, that are sent to Israel to arm their air force. And so the Israelis managed to beat back for a second time this massive Arab invasion. And a big reason why they're able to do so is because of the direct intervention of the United States and military aid provided to Israel by the Nixon administration. And so as a result of this, the Arab nations of the Middle East decide, which are many of which are petroleum-rich countries like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, they decide to respond to American support of the state of Israel and the decisive role that American military aid had given the Israelis in winning the Yom Kippur War by launching an oil embargo against the United States and many of its allies. And this is where we get to the second part of this, kind of path of American foreign policy and the American economy linking up with one another. Basically, during World War II, the United States was able to provide its own oil energy needs and the oil energy needs for most of its allies without any major assistance. America was able to produce enough oil for itself and for its allies to defeat both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II. But the situation had dramatically changed by the early 1970s. By the early 1970s, the United States was no longer energy independent. With the construction of the interstate highway system that it began in the late 1950s and the massive expansion of the American automobile industry, um, the American oil consumption soared in the period between the 1950s and the early 1970s. By 1973, even though the United States only comprised 6% of the world's population, it was consuming over 40% of its oil production on an annual basis. And increasingly, a large percentage of that oil was coming from nations belonging to the Organization of Petroleum Enriched Countries, or OPEC. And so the United States was receiving an increasing amount of imported oil with each passing year. And so when the OPEC countries decided to launch this oil embargo of the United States economy, which has already been weakened by the Vietnam War and by growing deficits, as well as stagnating wages and increasing inflation, is plunged into a full-fledged recession. The price of oil in the United States goes up by over 300%, in some places nearly 500%. And shortages begin to grow at an alarming rate. In many American cities, gas lines form around gas stations that stretch for miles as people try to fill up. The price of gas, of course, goes through the roof, rising above $1 for the first time. And in many gas stations, attendants actually feel sufficiently threatened that they feel the need to carry handguns with them at all times just to protect themselves. And, you know, so there's this sort of cascading effect on the American economy. And it particularly hits the American automobile and steel industries very hard. Um, the steel industry, of course, because a lot of the steel production in the United States is diverted to the automobile industry. And the automobile industry because basically during the post-war period, American car manufacturers had focused on producing one type of vehicle for the most part. Vehicles that were very large, very spacious on the inside, but also not what one would call fuel efficient. The term land yacht is sometimes used to describe the large passenger vehicles that were sold in the United States during the 1970s. And so basically, American automobile manufacturers find themselves caught behind the eight ball by the Arab oil embargo. They're producing these massive cars that do not provide good fuel economy to drivers. And so increasingly, many American consumers begin buying cars from foreign sources. They begin buying Toyotas and Datsuns, which is the predecessor company of Nissan. They changed the name to Nissan, I think, in 1983. And to a lesser extent, German cars. But many Americans begin buying foreign vehicles, particularly Japanese vehicles, because they offer something that American vehicles don't, and that's fuel economy. Belatedly, American factories do begin trying to produce fuel-efficient vehicles like the Chevy Vega and the Ford Pinto. But these vehicles become infamous for their problems. In the case of the Ford Pinto, It had a poorly placed gas tank that, if it was hit with a hard rear-end collision, would explode. And in the case of the Chevy Vega, because of efforts by GM's management to increase production, the cars were oftentimes poorly put together and were known for having massive amounts of problems. So there's both a decline in market share for American automobile manufacturers that comes as a result of the Arab oil embargo, but there is also a rather precipitous decline in quality as well, as many of these manufacturers rapidly rush to try to embrace labor-saving um, production methods that end up resulting in both massive labor unrest, such as the 1972 Lordstown strike in Lordstown, Ohio, the plant that made the Chevy Vega, as well as a general decline in the quality of the cars being produced. American cars in the 1970s generally are just not very good in terms of their quality. So there's a lot of these different things interacting with one another. And then you have the reaction of the government. The Nixon administration is, by the time the Arab oil embargo hits, the Nixon administration is already effectively crippled by the Watergate scandal, and it never really recovers from it. But the administrations that follow really aren't up to the task of dealing with the economic effects of stagflation either. Gerald Ford, who assumes the presidency after Nixon resigns in August of 1974, he's a pretty stand-up guy in terms of the people who actually knew him and his reputation. Interestingly enough, all three of the American presidents who served in the 1970s, including Richard Nixon, were former naval officers. But Ford, he was, someone who was known for his honesty, for his personal integrity. And when he became president after Nixon, he briefly enjoyed very high approval ratings because of his kind of straightforward Midwestern manner. But he does something very early in his presidency that proves to be very, very controversial. Even if the reason that he did it is one that many historians don't doubt the stated reason that he gave. About a month after Ford becomes president, he pardons Richard Nixon, making it impossible to prosecute him for any of the crimes that he committed during his time as president and during the Watergate scandal. Many Americans immediately react negatively to this. They see this as an example of the kind of pay-to-play nature of American politics. They accuse this of being a kind of political payback for Ford to Nixon, a sort of quid pro quo kind of thing. Ford's stated reason that he did it was that he wanted the country to move on from the Watergate scandal and not to dwell on it any longer. And there are very few people who doubt that he sincerely believed that, and that was in fact his intention, that it wasn't some sort of, larger, mysterious plot or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is, it did further erode public confidence in government at a time when public confidence in government had already been on a steady decline since the Vietnam War, and rapidly accelerated by Watergate. So it definitely didn't help things. And it pretty much immediately put Ford into a lame duck status. There was his approval ratings after he pardoned Nixon never rise above 50%. And many Americans really don't trust him after that point. And so as a result, his efforts to curb inflation, which he called WIN, or whip inflation now, really don't prove to be very effective. And even though the Arab oil embargo actually ends in the spring of 1974, even before Nixon resigns from office, it continues to have a devastating effect on the American economy. Throughout the 1970s, inflation rates continue to rise, unemployment rates continue to rise. Eventually, they reach nearly 10% by the end of the decade. And generally speaking, many Americans see a society that is increasingly, it appears, coming apart at the seams. The 1970s also see a marked spike in violent crime in many American metropolitan areas. There's a very significant rise in homicides and property and violent property crimes during the 1970s. Many American cities, like New York, um, begin showing physical signs of deterioration after decades of population relocation to the suburbs, or white flight, as some call it. And so there is this general decline in services that kind of coincides with all these things: the decline in manufacturing, um, a decline in union membership, stagnating wages, increased prices for pretty much everything. And so all of these things collectively begin leading to this growing, kind of nagging sense of, things fundamentally aren't right with this country, that things fundamentally are not going the way that they should be. And so there really is this profound sense of disillusionment that begins to sweep across the United States in the 1970s. It's briefly buoyed with the election of Jimmy Carter in 1976. Carter kind of captures into this sort of post Watergate um, sense of disillusionment. He runs a very honest campaign. He portrays himself as a man of the people, a peanut farmer, famously. Kind of downplays his actually quite extensive education and engineering background. He was actually one of the first American people involved in the nuclear submarine program. Um, and he kind of portrays himself as a sort of aw shucks Southern guy. He also taps into a growing religiosity in American society, this growing evangelical movement in American society. He's the first um, presidential candidate to describe himself as a born again Christian. And so, kind of capitalizing on that post Watergate sort of disillusionment, um, and promising something fresh and honest, but also reflecting generally low enthusiasm in government and in the electoral system in general. Um, Carter manages to eke out a very, very marginal victory in 1976. I think like 50.1% is the actual percentage that he won of the popular vote. So, not a very clear margin of victory. Another notable fact about the election in 1976 is that, much as in 2016, the largest share of voters in that year's election were non voters, with many Americans increasingly turned off by the electoral system and by politics. And that's another major trend, which I will be discussing in a future video. So that pretty much concludes this one. And we'll look at the presidency of Jimmy Carter in the next video.